Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez audio and video podcast series. Today, we're going to dive into some really challenging and, frankly, pretty provocative ideas about power, technology, and identity. We've pulled together several different sources that all seem to be asking one fundamental question. What if the story we're all being told isn't the whole story?
All right, so let's really kick things off with this question, because it's at the heart of everything we're looking at today. The thing is, all the perspectives we're about to explore, they're all basically arguing the same thing, that the accepted narratives, the ones we get from the news, from our institutions, might be leaving out some really crucial details.
Okay, so first up, let's talk about the big picture, global power. According to one viewpoint we looked at, what's happening on the world stage isn't just a small shift. No, the argument is that the entire world order is being torn down and rebuilt as we speak. So how do we make sense of what's happening between, say, the US and China? Well, some analysts are reaching way back into ancient history, to this idea called the Thucydides trap. Basically, the idea is simple, but it's also kind of scary. When a new power starts to rise up and challenge the top dog, history shows us that war is, it's incredibly likely. And the argument here is that this isn't just ancient history, it's happening right now, right before our eyes.
And listen, this isn't just some abstract theory. You can actually see this power shift happening in the numbers. This is 2024 data, and it uses a really interesting metric called purchasing power parity, or PPP. Forget exchange rates for a second. PPP tries to figure out how much your money can actually buy in different places. And when you look at it that way, a way many economists think is more accurate, China's economy isn't just catching up. It's already pulled ahead of the United States, significantly.
Right, so this whole global power struggle, it's not just happening in spreadsheets and GDP reports. It's being fought with real-world economic weapons. And the sources we're looking at really dig into things like tariffs, showing how these big geopolitical moves actually affect, real people.
So to make this super concrete, one analysis brings up this crazy example. A reported 50% tariff on coffee coming from Brazil. 50%. That's not just a minor tweak in trade policy. The source presents this as a huge economic shot fired, a real warning shot across the bow.
And you might be thinking, okay, so what does a tariff on Brazilian coffee have to do with me? Well, the argument is everything. The same source claims these policies have a direct ripple effect. They point to a price jump of almost 15% for coffee right here at home, not to mention big price hikes on other things you buy every week, like meat and eggs.
So here's the real kicker. According to this analysis, this isn't about fair trade or protecting local industries. The argument is that this is something else entirely. Economic lawfare. That's the term they use. It's about using economic muscle as a weapon to force other countries to change their behavior. It's a geopolitical tool, plain and simple.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit, because this whole theme of hidden forces and control, it doesn't just play out on the world stage. It gets way more personal. We're talking about the device that's probably in your hand or pocket right now. Yep, your smartphone. Several sources we reviewed make a pretty compelling case that our digital lives come with some serious hidden costs.
And look, the data here is, it's pretty shocking. This comes from a global study, and it shows what looks like a really strong connection between how old a young person is when they get their first smartphone and their mental health down the road. Just look at this. For women who got their first phone when they were just 6 years old, 45% of them reported having suicidal thoughts as adults. Now compare that to women who waited until they were 13, that number drops to 28%. That is a massive, massive difference. And it's not just about feeling anxious or depressed. The research points to a whole range of really disturbing outcomes linked to getting a phone too early. We're talking about things like increased aggression, a feeling of being detached from the real world, suicidal thoughts, even diminished self-worth. The suggestion here is that this isn't just an individual problem. It could be shaping our entire society. So this concern about technology, it's not just about our mental health. It goes deeper, into the realm of surveillance and control. One source we looked at brought up this really powerful metaphor, the panopticon. Imagine a prison where one guard can see every inmate, but the inmates never know if they're being watched at that exact moment. What happens? They start policing their own behavior, just in case. That's the core idea. And this is where the argument takes a really unexpected turn. It connects this idea of surveillance directly to, of all things, Karl Marx. The perspective here is that if you get rid of physical money, a core Marxist idea, you would have no choice but to create a total surveillance state.
Why? Because you'd have to track every single transaction, every input and output manually. In effect, you'd be building a real-world panopticon.
Okay, so for this next section, we're going to step into some pretty contentious territory. The arguments here touch on really complex and sensitive topics: race, culture, identity. And they definitely challenge a lot of mainstream thinking. I just want to be super clear here. Our goal is to explain the viewpoints we found in the source material, to lay them out for you as they were presented.
All right, so one article we reviewed puts forward the argument that a nation's culture and its identity are, in its words, indelibly linked with the racial phenotype of its population. The author points to countries like Germany as an example, claiming that a nation's core character is directly tied to its ethnic makeup. The piece even uses the German word Völkisch, which is a historically very loaded term, to really drive home this idea of a racial identity.
And this same line of thinking extends to modern media. This source identifies a trend that it calls race swapping. The argument here is that when you see an established character in a movie or an ad whose race has been changed, it's not just a creative decision. The claim is that it's a deliberate and targeted effort to, in their words, negate or obfuscate what it means to be European.
Now, a different source we looked at presents a very contrarian view on the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. This perspective directly questions some of the most common explanations, like systemic racism. The author argues that economic progress for Black Americans actually hit a wall after race-based preferences were put in place. The source even challenges the idea that historical redlining is the primary driver of the gap today, suggesting its impact is often exaggerated.
Okay, for our last section, we're moving from questioning narratives to claims of, outright systemic corruption. We're going to look at some alternative explanations for some of the biggest crises we're facing today.
So one source gets right to the point. It asks a simple question: who's really behind the international drug trade? But the answer it provides is anything but simple. It doesn't point the finger at the usual suspects, the cartels. Instead, it claims that state actors are involved. Here's the theory the source lays out, step by step. First, it starts with the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, which, it says, led to an explosion in poppy crops. Step 2, all that opium wasn't just destroyed. The claim is that it was legally imported into the U.S. and used to make prescription painkillers like morphine. And then, Step 3, overprescription of those pills created a generation of addicts who, when the prescriptions ran out, turned to street heroin. The source alleges this was a direct, predictable chain of events. So we've covered a lot of ground, right? From global power shifts to smartphones to the opioid crisis. What's the one thing that ties all these different arguments together? It really comes down to one word: skepticism. A really deep, profound skepticism. Every single one of these sources, in its own way, is telling you not to trust the official story. They're all pushing their readers to believe that there are hidden forces, hidden agendas, shaping our world.
And that leaves us with a huge and honestly a really important question to think about. We live in a world that is just flooded with competing stories with totally contradictory narratives. So the challenge for you, for me, for all of us is, how do we figure out what's true? How do we find the real story in all the noise? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenia Maria Sanchez audio and video podcast series, produced and archived at the website dailybriefs.info.